Deep in the heart of the forest, a family of travelers stumbled upon a strange and unexpected sight: an abandoned bus. The vehicle had clearly been standing there for decades. Its wheels were nothing more than crumbling remnants, overtaken by moss and vines, while the exterior hull was slowly succumbing to the grip of nature. Yet, even in its dilapidated state, there was something intriguing about it. As they walked around the old bus, they noticed the door, once meant for passengers to embark on adventures, had seen recent use. Stephen and his father were no strangers to forest explorations. Their small town, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woodlands, was the perfect gateway to nature's playground. The sparsely populated area wasn't ideal for urban living, but for adventurers and nature enthusiasts, it was a paradise. Stephen and his father cherished their weekend excursions, venturing into the wilderness to uncover new sights and experiences. Their routine often involved overnight stays in rustic shelters or family-run inns, adding a touch of simplicity to their adventures. This particular weekend began like any other. They had planned to stay at a small shelter nestled deep in the forest. But when they arrived, they were met with disappointment. The shelter was fully booked, leaving no space for them to rest. Rather than letting the setback dampen their spirits, they decided to explore the surrounding woods. The afternoon was young, and the forest beckoned them with its serene beauty. As they wandered deeper into the trees, the towering pines and oaks grew denser, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The crisp scent of pine mingled with the earthy aroma of damp leaves, creating an intoxicating atmosphere. The farther they went, the quieter the world became, until even the sounds of the shelter faded into silence. Lost in the tranquility of the moment, they roamed freely, marveling at the unspoiled beauty around them. Eventually, Stephen spotted something unusual. Behind a small hillock, partially concealed by the undergrowth, a metal roof glinted faintly in the waning sunlight. Intrigued, he pointed it out to his father. Together they approached the mysterious structure, their curiosity growing with every step. When they crested the hill, they saw it in full: an old, rusting bus, its roof barely visible beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves and creeping vegetation. They circled the bus, taking in the details. The once bright paint had faded to a dull, peeling shadow of its former self, and rust had eaten away at large sections of the metal. Yet, despite the obvious decay, one detail stood out: the door showed signs of frequent use. Its edges were worn smooth, and the ground in front of it was free of debris. Whoever had been here had left their mark. Driven by equal parts caution and curiosity, they decided to look inside. What they found stunned them. The interior of the bus was a stark contrast to its weathered exterior. It had been transformed into a small, cozy home. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a hidden sanctuary amid the wilderness. The walls, though rusting on the outside, had been lined with wooden panels that gave the space a rustic charm. A pair of simple yet sturdy beds stood against one side, and a hanging table occupied the center. A curtain separated the sleeping area from what appeared to be a makeshift kitchen and living space. Despite its compact size, the bus-turned home was astonishingly well equipped. A small kitchenette featured a rudimentary stove and storage shelves stocked with preserved goods. Outside, a water tank had been installed, presumably feeding into the tiny shower that occupied one corner of the bus. Though there was no electricity, the ingenious setup hinted at a life of quiet self-sufficiency. Whoever had created this space had clearly sought to escape the modern world and embrace the simplicity of nature. Father and son lingered for a while, marveling at the ingenuity and care that had gone into converting the bus. The silence of the forest enveloped them, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. They couldn't help but wonder about the person who had built this hidden refuge. What had driven them to abandon the trappings of civilization? And where were they now? When they finally returned to the village, they couldn't resist sharing their discovery. The owner of the shelter, an elderly man with a wealth of local knowledge, nodded knowingly when they described the bus. "Ah, the hermit's bus," he said with a wistful smile. "A man once lived there years ago. Tired of the hustle and bustle of city life, he came to the forest and made that bus his home. They say he lived there for decades, turning it into a little paradise in the woods. It's a true forest fairy tale." Stephen and his father listened intently, their imaginations filling in the gaps of the hermit's story. The idea of turning an abandoned bus into a haven spoke to something deep within them, a longing for simplicity, for freedom, for a connection to nature that modern life often overshadowed. The shelter owner smiled fondly as he recounted the tale of the hermit who had transformed the bus. He was a quiet man, the shelter owner said, sipping his tea. He came to the area about 20 years ago. Nobody really knew where he came from or why he chose to stay. But he had this knack for turning nothing into something extraordinary. Stephen and his father listened intently, their curiosity piqued. Did he live there alone? Stephen asked. Mostly, the owner replied. He kept to himself but wasn't unfriendly. Sometimes he'd come into the village for supplies, maybe once every few months. Always polite, always had a kind word. But he never talked about his past. To us, he was just the busman. What happened to him? Stephen's father asked. The owner shrugged. One day he stopped coming. People assumed he'd moved on, maybe found somewhere even quieter. Or maybe, well, the forest can be unforgiving. Nobody's been out there to check. Most folks around here respect his choice to vanish. That night Stephen lay awake, thinking about the mysterious hermit. The idea of someone turning their back on society and building a life in solitude both intrigued and unsettled him. He couldn't shake the image of the cozy, plant-covered bus nestled deep in the forest. The next morning, Stephen and his father decided to revisit the bus. Armed with flashlights and a small backpack of supplies, they set out, retracing their steps through the thickening forest. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground with light. As they approached the hillock, the metallic roof of the bus came into view once again, almost camouflaged by the creeping vegetation. This time they decided to explore the surroundings more thoroughly. Behind the bus, they discovered a small garden, overgrown but still recognizable. Rows of what might have once been vegetables were now a wild tangle of greenery. Nearby, a handmade wooden bench sat facing a clearing, as if the hermit had carved out a spot to watch the sunrise. Inside the bus, Stephen's father noticed something they had missed the day before: a small journal tucked under one of the beds. Its cover was weathered, the pages yellowed and slightly brittle. Stephen hesitated before opening it, feeling as though they were intruding on something private. But curiosity got the better of him. The first page was filled with neat handwriting. It read, "To whoever finds this, welcome. This bus has been my sanctuary, my refuge from a world that grew too loud and too fast. Here I found peace in the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds. If you've stumbled upon this place, I hope it brings you the same solace it brought me. Life is simpler here. Breathe deeply and listen to the forest. It will guide you." The rest of the journal was a mix of reflections, sketches of the forest, and practical notes about living off the land. There were entries about the best times to plant certain vegetables, how to purify water, and even recipes for meals made from foraged ingredients. One page had a detailed sketch of the bus, labeled with plans for improvements the hermit had dreamed of making but never got around to. He really poured his heart into this place, Stephen's father said, turning a page to reveal a drawing of the bench they'd seen outside. Beneath it, the hermit had written the best seat in the house for a show no theater can rival. As they continued reading, a picture of the hermit's life began to emerge, a man who had found joy in simplicity and solitude. But there were hints of sorrow, too. One entry mentioned a lost love, another a falling out with family. The journal ended abruptly, with no farewell or explanation for the hermit's disappearance. "Do you think he's still out there somewhere?" Stephen asked, his voice hushed. "Maybe," his father said. "Or maybe he left this behind for someone like us to find." They left the journal where they had found it, feeling it belonged to the bus as much as the rusted walls and the garden outside. Before leaving, they took a moment to sit on the wooden bench, letting the forest's quiet embrace them. The chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves seemed to echo the hermit's sentiment: life was simpler here. When they returned to the village later that day, Stephen and his father couldn't stop talking about the bus. They shared what they had found with the shelter owner, who seemed both surprised and delighted to hear about the journal. "Sounds like he wanted his story to live on in some way," the owner mused. "Maybe you were meant to find it." Stephen nodded, feeling a strange sense of connection to the man who had once called the bus home. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, he imagined what it would be like to live a life as free and unburdened as the hermit's, surrounded by nothing but nature and the quiet hum of the forest.